Well, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm very happy to have with us speaking Dr. Raúl Madrid from the University of Texas at Austin, and Professor Rafael Loayza, who's in La Paz, streaming, present with us virtually, and they will both be speaking today on as a part of our third virtual dialogue. So as a part of this presentation, I wanted to introduce very briefly what the virtual dialogue series is. We will be organizing 4 this year. This is our third virtual dialogue. The objective of the series, as many of you know who have been here in the past, is to bring scholars from Latin America and scholars from the United States together to discuss and debate specific policy challenges, as well as recent political trends that affect the region of Latin America and that also may impact U.S.-Latin American relations. And so we're very excited today to have 2 quite distinguished experts on Bolivian politics, and we have asked them to foreshadow what is at stake in the upcoming general election by examining the evolution of the country since President Morales first came to power. Before I turn the floor over to our presenters and officially introduce them, I wanted to provide some initial observations on how I think Bolivia has changed, or at least raise some questions about some of the potential changes that have occurred since Evo Morales was first elected to the presidency in 2005. I began traveling personally to Bolivia in the early 2000s, when Evo Morales was more of a political threat than he was a likely presidential candidate. And so it's very clear that much has changed since then. Both the profile of Evo Morales and Bolivia itself has undergone many changes in that, now 9-year period that Evo has been in the presidency. For those of you less familiar with Bolivian politics, I thought I would just emphasize why his election was so important, his first election in 2005. And I would suggest that his election was remarkable for 3 reasons, at least 3 reasons. I will highlight 3. One is that in recent Bolivian democratic history, he is the first president to capture an absolute majority of the vote in the first election, in the popular election. So in the past, political contests, presidential campaigns were highly contested between 3 major political parties. None of those parties ever won a majority of the vote, and so Congress had to decide the president via the formation of coalitions. And so essentially Evo comes to power without having to rely on a coalition with any other party. He has an absolute majority. So this is a remarkable event in Bolivia's political history. It's also remarkable because when he's elected to office, it's kind of the culmination of several years of political crisis, of social crisis even, in conflict. And his election to the presidency marks the end of a 20-year period where you had 3 political parties alternating power. You had the MNR as the centrist party, I guess you could say. They were all very similar. ADN, center-right party, and the MIR as the center-left party. They dominated politics for 20 years. Evo Morales comes to power, and these 3 parties essentially disappear from national politics overnight. So it's a pretty remarkable change, not just for the presidency, but for the party system and the political system. And then perhaps most obviously, his election is remarkable because he is, as we like to say, Bolivia's first indigenous president. And so that in and of itself is quite remarkable in a country that, depending on the survey, depending on the questions that you ask, well over a majority of Bolivians identify as indigenous. So this is the first time in at least 20 years of contemporary democracy that an indigenous person is elected to the presidency. Okay, so what kind of changes have come about since he's been elected to office? Well, I think anyone who travels to Bolivia regularly, I've spent most of my time in La Paz, and so I'll speak mostly about La Paz en el Alto, which is the sister city sitting above La Paz. But it's really changed incredibly, La Paz, over the last 9 years. In some ways, it's become much more modern, I guess, surprisingly enough, much more international, much more cosmopolitan. Paseños, the citizens of La Paz, you can tell they have a lot of pride in how the city is changing for the better. El Alto, the sister city that sits above La Paz, where the international airport is located, traditionally a center where a lot of indigenous communities were located, those that had migrated from rural areas to La Paz. A lot of them settled in El Alto. It has become the capitalist center of Bolivia today, depending on who you speak to. It's a thriving city and a thriving capitalist city. I can decirlo, you have to admit it. Recently, the New York Times published an article on Bolivia proclaiming, oh, there goes our, anyway. Recently, the New York Times published an article proclaiming Bolivia as the exception to a rule in Latin America, the exception to the rule of economic downturn and crisis. Bolivia, in fact, seems to be doing fairly well economically. Some see Evo Morales as being a very prudent president in office. Yes, his country depends upon natural resources as the primary source of revenue for the state, but the country has one of the largest sets of foreign reserves vis-a-vis the size of the economy in the world. So it seems to be a fairly solvent economic situation in a region where Argentina is suffering, Venezuela is obviously suffering. This is pretty remarkable. On the other hand, oftentimes when I'm in La Paz and I speak with Professor Loayza, we'll talk about how the black market has exploded, how the state has very low capacity for collecting taxes, and so there is some indication of less sort of economic, not quite so healthy economic indicators, right? And so one of the things that I hope we can talk about is how we understand these economic transformations. Do they cohere with Evo's revolutionary rhetoric? And indeed, the assessments of Evo's legacy in terms of the political system has been quite mixed. So if you read about Evo, depending on who's speaking, you'll hear something very different. This is very common today. This is true as well with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. This is true of many places. But for some, Evo's main accomplishment has been the inclusion of formerly excluded groups into politics. The poor, the indigenous, even the individuals with very little formal education have become, in some ways, the new political elite in the country. He has implemented major institutional changes. The 2009 Constitution might be the most prominent, where he recognizes the country as being plurinational in nature, that is, more than one nationality living within the same state. This, I think, in response to long-standing patterns of exclusion that emerged when past governments attempted to impose a single Bolivian nationality on all citizens, which created a sense of exclusion and marginalization. Others take a much more critical perspective of Evo Morales. And this perspective comes from multiple ideological perspectives. So from the more radical left, people like James Petras will look at Evo and say, this is nothing more, what he's put into place is a radical conservative regime. A radical rhetoric alongside very conservative orthodox economic policies. He is a neoliberal that uses radical rhetoric to maintain the popularity of the majority of Bolivians. And so that's his largest critique, right? So the economic model hasn't changed, long-standing interests haven't become unentrenched, and so there's nothing really revolutionary about this government. Others take the perspective, from the perspective of liberal democracy, will suggest that Morales' time in office has meant a degradation of the country's democratic regime. The inclusion of some groups has meant the exclusion, sometimes explicit, sometimes coercive exclusion of other groups. Evo has concentrated power into the presidency at the expense of horizontal accountability, at the expense of checks and balances, and at the expense of institutional independence. Despite these differences, it is perhaps indisputable that Evo's election is itself a remarkable step forward for Bolivian politics. He is the country's first indigenous president. Some look at the MAS, his party, the Movimiento del Socialismo, as an indigenous party. I tend to take the perspective that it's more than that. It is an indigenous party, but there's much more to it as well, right? The roots of the party come from economic, really, and class-based grievances more so than identity politics. But it is clear today that Evo draws some of his appeal and makes explicit appeals based on ethnicity, based on ethnic identity. And so another question that I'm certain we'll look at today is what the impact of the politicization of ethnic identity has been on the construction of that identity in the country, right? So who identifies today as being indigenous that maybe didn't identify in the past? and also on racism in the country, which is something that's pervasive, sometimes more explicit, sometimes more implicit, less obvious. And then finally, I think it would be remiss to talk about politics in the country without talking about what there is to talk about of the opposition to EVO, right? And so right now, what's remarkable about this new political system is that you have a predominant party, EVO's MAS. Some call it a political instrument, but nonetheless, a political party in power, and a very fledgling, weakly unified, highly fragmented opposition. And so what this means is that Evo Morales he ran for office in 2000. He wins in 2005. He wins with an even larger vote share in 2009. And it looks like he'll win with an even larger vote share, according to some analysts, in the election coming up in October of this year. So how can we explain this predominance? On the one hand, Evo is extremely popular. He regularly does well in terms of approval ratings. But on the other, it's the fact that there really hasn't been an opposition to organize against him. Even though there are many Bolivians, I think, who feel excluded by this political system. So, with that, those are some of the questions I wanted to pose, some thoughts I wanted to make, and I wanted to bring it back to sort of what advances then have been made in terms of the economy, the society, in terms of politics. What setbacks have happened since then? And I'm very pleased that we have two distinguished scholars with us today to talk about these questions. I'll present both of them first, and then I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Madrid. This is Dr. Raúl Madrid. He is the professor of government. He is a professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin. Many of you have probably read his work. He's published in many journals. He's highly published. He's published 2 books, the most recent of which I have here, I'm very excited, is called The Rise of Ethnic Politics in Latin America, where he tries to understand how it is that today, or recently, indigenous parties have become much more electorally successful, even though obviously indigenous groups have been present in the region, since for a very, very, very long time, goes without saying. And so one of the cases that he looks at is the rise of the MAS. And so he is well placed to talk about what's happened in Bolivia over the last 9 years. Professor Rafael Loayza is the director of the Department of Communication Studies at the Universidad Católica San Pablo, the Catholic University in Bolivia. He too has written extensively on Bolivia, on the rise of the MAS, and ethnicity in the country. His most recent publications include an article entitled The Politics of Evo Morales' Rise to Power in Bolivia, the Role of Social Movements and Think Tanks. It's really, really interesting. And he has a book entitled, and I'm going to butcher this title, A la Tayata, which examines ethnicity and racism in Bolivia. So I'm just very pleased that both of them came today and agreed to share their thoughts with us.